The blizzard howled through the Montana wilderness like an angry beast that wanted to destroy everything in its path. And Jake Morrison sat alone in his wooden cabin, watching the fire burn in the stone fireplace while the wind screamed outside, trying to break through the walls and windows, but the cabin held strong because it was built well. And Jake knew how to maintain it properly after living there for 3 years in complete isolation from the rest of the world. Jake had been a soldier, once, and a good one too. But that was before Earth met aliens from space and everything changed forever, because the Galactic Council came down from the stars with their fancy ships and smooth words telling everyone that humanity was now part of a bigger family and that they would help Earth grow and prosper. But Jake saw things during his time in the Unified Earth Defense Force that made him doubt their kind words, and eventually he just walked away from it all and came to this remote place where he could pretend the stars were still empty and cold. He threw another log onto the fire and watched the flames dance higher, while the heat pushed back against the cold that tried to seep through every crack and gap in the walls, and he was thinking about making some coffee when he heard something strange that did not belong to the storm at all, because it was a sound like someone crying out in pain or fear, or maybe both, and it came from somewhere outside in the freezing darkness. Jake stopped moving and listened harder, trying to figure out if he really heard it or if the wind was playing tricks on his ears. But then it came again, clearer this time and definitely real. So he grabbed his heavy coat from the hook by the door and pulled it on quickly while also taking his flashlight from the shelf, because going outside in a blizzard without light was a good way to get lost and die. The cold hit him like a punch when he opened the door and stepped into the knee-deep snow that covered everything in white, and the wind tried to push him back inside. But Jake was strong and stubborn, so he pushed forward into the storm with his flashlight cutting through the swirling white curtain of falling snow and ice. He walked in, the direction where he thought the sound came from, and kept calling out to see if anyone would answer. But the wind stole his words and threw them away into the darkness, and he was starting to think maybe he should turn back when his light found something that made him stop and stare, because it was impossible, but also very real. There was a woman collapsed against a fallen pine tree, and she was definitely not human, even though she had the same basic shape with 2 arms and 2 legs and a head, but her skin glowed with a soft purple color like twilight, and her hair was silver white like fresh snow. And even though she was covered in melting ice and shivering violently, Jake could see that her ears were pointed like the elves from old fairy tales. She wore robes that looked like they were woven from starlight itself, but they were torn and stained with dark blood, and she had wounds on her arms and legs that were still bleeding slowly. And when she saw Jake, her eyes opened wide, and they were violet-colored and glowing faintly in the darkness, and those eyes held so much fear and hope mixed together that Jake felt his heart twist in his chest. The alien woman tried to speak, and her voice sounded like wind chimes mixed with distant thunder, but Jake could not understand any of the words she said, and tears were freezing on her cheeks as she reached toward him, with one trembling hand like she was begging for help. Jake did not think about it or question it, because someone was hurt and freezing, and that was all that mattered. So he bent down and scooped her into his arms and was surprised by how light she felt, like she weighed almost nothing at all. And he turned back toward his cabin and walked as fast as he could through the deep snow while the woman shivered against his chest. When he got back inside, he laid her down carefully on the floor in front of the fire and ran to get every blanket he owned and wrapped them around her small form, trying to trap whatever heat was left in her body and stop her from shaking so hard, because it looked like she was going to break apart from the cold. Her skin felt like ice when he touched her hands and tried to warm them between his own palms, and he noticed strange tattoos running up and down her arms that glowed softly with their own light, and the glow pulsed in time with her heartbeat, which was very slow and weak. Jake looked at her face and saw how young she seemed, even though he knew aliens probably aged differently than humans, and he wondered who she was and where she came from and why she was dying in the snow outside his cabin in the middle of nowhere. Montana. Her eyes fluttered open again and focused on him with difficulty, and she tried to speak once more in that strange musical language, and then her hand moved slowly to touch something at her throat, which looked like a metal collar, and when she pressed it, the device sparked once, then twice, then started glowing with a soft blue light. The alien woman spoke again, and this time Jake heard words he could understand, even though her accent was strange, and the words came out broken like she was struggling to form them properly. She said, "Please, and they are coming, and they will kill us both." Jake felt ice run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold outside, and he stood up quickly and went to the window to look out into the storm, but he could not see anything except swirling snow and darkness. Then, he heard it and his blood went cold because it was a sound that no animal on earth had ever made before, and it was a roar that shook the whole cabin and made dust fall from the ceiling beams, and it was full of rage and power, and something very old and dangerous. Jake ran back to the window and looked up at the sky and saw a shape moving through the storm clouds, and it was huge with wings that blocked out what little light came from the stars, and its scales gleamed like black glass, and its eyes burned like twin suns, and Jake realized with shock that he was looking at a dragon. And not just any dragon, but a real, living, breathing dragon that should not exist. The alien woman struggled to sit up despite the pain that twisted her face, and she looked toward the window, and then impossibly she smiled, like seeing the dragon made her happy instead of terrified. She whispered a name, which was Ember, and said, "My companion," and she found me. The dragon landed outside with such force that the ground shook and items fell off shelves inside the cabin, and Jake grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace because every instinct told him to defend himself. But the alien woman grabbed his wrist with surprising strength for someone so injured. She said no, and she protects me. And we are bonded. Jake stared at her and then at the massive dragon head that appeared in his window, with eyes that looked at him with clear intelligence and understanding, like it was thinking and judging him, and he thought about his quiet, peaceful life that he built so carefully over 3 years and how it was all falling apart in the span of one night. The alien woman, whose name he still did not know, coughed and winced in pain and said her name was Lyran, and she was from a people called the Alir, and she needed help to stop a war that would destroy his entire world if someone did not act soon. Jake looked at her with her purple skin and silver hair and glowing tattoos, and then at the dragon outside his window, and then at his rifle in his hands, and he thought about everything he left behind when he came to this mountain, and how hard he tried to escape from the problems of the wider universe. But looking at Lyran and seeing the desperation in her alien face and the wounds that covered her body, he knew he could not turn away no matter how much he wanted his peaceful, isolated life back. So Jake lowered his rifle and set it aside and said, "All right, and start talking, and someone better make sure that dragon does not eat my truck." Lyran laughed, which turned into another cough, but her eyes showed relief and gratitude, and maybe the beginning of hope. Dawn broke over the snow-covered mountains and painted everything in shades of gold and pink, and the storm had finally passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness that felt strange after all the howling wind. And Jake stood at the window of his cabin, watching the sun rise, while behind him, Lyran sat wrapped in blankets with her wounds cleaned and bandaged, using the medical supplies he kept for emergencies, outside in the snow. Ember lay coiled up like a massive cat, and her body gave off so much heat that all the snow around her had melted in a perfect circle, leaving bare ground that steamed in the cold morning air. And Jake still could not believe he was looking at a real dragon. But there she was, breathing slowly, and watching everything. With those intelligent burning eyes, Lyran sipped the hot broth Jake had made for her, and the translator device at her throat worked properly now, so her words came out smooth and clear when she spoke. And she told Jake that his people had many wrong ideas about the galaxy and about the Galactic Council that came to Earth 3 years ago, with promises of friendship and progress. She said the Council was not what they pretended to be, and they were not peacekeepers or friends but conquerors, who had built an empire across hundreds of star systems, and they took what they wanted from every world they touched, and left those worlds broken and enslaved, even though they used gentle words and smiled while they did it. Jake turned away from the window and looked at her hard, because what she was saying meant everything he feared during his military service was true, and maybe even worse than he thought. Lyran continued talking, and her violet eyes grew darker with old pain, and she explained that her people, the Alir, had once been part of the Council way back in the beginning when it first formed, and they believed the Council wanted to unite different species and help everyone grow stronger together. But after 300 years, the Alir discovered the truth about what the Council really did. She told him about secret programs where the Council took resources from conquered worlds and left nothing behind, and about laboratories where they did horrible experiments on species, They considered less advanced and about how they slowly erased the cultures and histories of any people who did not obey their rules completely. The Alir had tried to stop it, and they spoke out against the injustice. And when the council refused to listen or change, the Alir rebelled and left the council, and that was 300 years ago. And the Alir had been fighting the council ever since, trying to free other worlds and protect species who could not protect themselves. Jake pulled up a chair and sat down facing her and asked what any of this had to do with Earth, because his world seemed far away from these galactic wars and political games. Lyraean leaned forward, and her expression became very serious, and she said, Earth was more important than Jake realized, because the planet sat at a crossroads of multiple hyperspace lanes, which made it valuable for trade and military movement. But more than that, humanity itself was valuable because humans adapted quickly to new situations and thought in creative ways and refused to give up even when facing impossible odds. And the council feared what humanity could become if given time to grow strong. She explained that the council was moving slowly and carefully with Earth, and the technology they shared was old and weak compared to what they really had, and the trade agreements they offered heavily favored the council, and all the cultural exchange programs were designed to make humanity dependent on alien goods and ideas until Earth forgot how to stand on its own. Lyran said that within 20 years Earth would become a client state that depended completely on the council for everything, and within 50 years humanity would be slaves in all but name, and they would not even realize it happened, because the chains would be invisible and comfortable. Jake felt anger rising in his chest like a fire, because he had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it laid out so clearly made it real and dangerous, and he asked Lyran why he should believe her because she was a stranger who crashed near his cabin, and he only had her word. Lyran reached into her torn robes and pulled out a small crystal that glowed with inner light, and she held it up and said this was proof, and it contained intercepted communications between council officials and financial records, showing how they cheated Earth in every deal, and military deployment plans for forces that would occupy Earth once humanity was weak enough. She told Jake she had been carrying this data crystal to a resistance cell hidden on the moon when her ship got ambushed by council hunters, and she barely escaped in a pod that crashed in the Montana wilderness, and the hunters followed her and would keep following until they killed her and took back the crystal. Jake asked why she did not take the crystal directly to Earth governments or military leaders who could use the information. Lyran's face grew grim and sad, and she said the council already had agents working inside Earth governments, and they had bought or blackmailed key officials, and if she went to the wrong person, the data would disappear, and she would die, and no one would ever know the truth, as if the universe was listening to their conversation. Ember suddenly raised her massive head and looked toward the east, and a deep growl rumbled from her throat like distant thunder, and Jake knew without being told that something bad was coming, grabbed his rifle and went to the window and looked out across the snow. And in the distance he saw 3 figures moving toward the cabin, and they moved with a grace that was not human, and wore armor that seemed to shimmer and change color to match the snow around them, and they carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. Lyraean struggled to stand up despite her injuries, and she looked out the window and her face went pale, and she whispered that those were council enforcers, and they were elite soldiers trained to hunt down rebels, and if the enforcers caught them both, Jake and Lyran would die, and the data crystal would be destroyed. Jake checked his rifle and made sure it was loaded, and asked Lyran if she could fight. She shook her head and said she could barely stand up, let alone fight trained soldiers. So Jake asked if Ember could fight. Lyraean's eyes flashed with fierce pride, and she said Ember was bred in the war forges of the Alir homeworld, and had fought in battles that would make human nightmares look peaceful. But even Ember was not invincible, and the enforcers had weapons specifically designed to kill dragons. Jake watched the 3 figures getting closer and estimated he had maybe 5 minutes before they arrived, and he asked how long they had. Lyraean said minutes or maybe less. He looked at the data crystal that could save his world, and then at Lyraean, who had risked everything to bring that information, and then at the enforcers who wanted to silence the truth forever, and every part of him wanted to stay out of it and let the galaxy handle its own problems, because he came to the mountains to escape exactly this kind of situation. But he thought about Earth and about his family and friends living normal lives, not knowing they were being slowly trapped, and he thought about future generations who would grow up as slaves and never know freedom. Jake made his decision and went to a cabinet and pulled out extra weapons and ammunition and boxes of supplies he kept from his military days, and he started planning because if 3 alien super soldiers wanted a fight, he would give them one. They would never forget. Lyrian watched him work and asked what he was going to do. Jake smiled, but it was not a friendly smile, and he said they were going to survive and protect that data crystal and make sure the enforcers regretted coming to his mountain. Outside, Ember roared and spread her massive wings ready for battle. The 3 enforcers moved through the snow like hunting wolves, and they were creatures called Krell, who came from a reptilian species known across the galaxy for being ruthless and completely loyal to the Council, and each one stood 7 feet, tall with scaled skin that had been enhanced with cybernetic implants that made them into living weapons. The leader, whose name was Vex, scanned the area with sensors built into his armor, and he detected 2 life forms inside the primitive human, dwelling ahead, and one was definitely alien and the other was human. And he felt satisfied because his mission was almost complete. His second-in-command, whose name was Kresh, asked about the dragon. Vex said the dragon was circling above, but they had anti-armor plasma charges that would bring the beast down easily. And he activated his communication device and reported to command that they had located the target and were preparing to eliminate her and retrieve the stolen data inside the cabin. Jake worked fast and his hands were steady, even though adrenaline pumped through his veins because he had been in combat before and knew how to control his fear and turn it into focus. And he rigged several traps using his old military training, combined with supplies he found around the cabin. Lyrian watched him, and despite her injuries, she had managed to pull herself together, and her warrior training showed through, and in her hands she held a weapon that had been hidden in her robes, and it was a blade that hummed with contained energy and glowed with a blue light. Jake told her that when the fighting started it would get loud and violent, and she needed to stay low and move fast and stay alive before he could finish his sentence. The front window exploded inward as a bolt of superheated plasma tore through the cabin and missed Jake by only inches, and the attack had begun without warning. Jake rolled across the floor and came up with his rifle ready and fired through the broken window, and his bullets hit the lead enforcer armor and sparked off the surface, but the creature staggered backward because human weapons might be primitive. But physics still worked the same way everywhere, and kinetic energy still had an impact. Lyrian sent out a mental call to Ember through the psychic bond they shared, and it was a connection that went beyond normal understanding and existed on a level that humans could not fully comprehend. The dragon answered with a roar that split the morning air, and she dove from above with her massive claws extended and targeted the enforcers with lethal intent, and one of the Krell barely had time to look up before 1,000 pounds of muscle and scale crashed into him and drove him deep into the snow and crushed his armor like paper. But the other 2 enforcers were ready and trained for exactly this kind of situation, and they fired their plasma weapons in perfect coordination, and the superheated bolts streaked toward Ember, who twisted in midair with impossible grace for something so large, but one charge clipped her wing and burned through the membrane, and she screamed in pain. Jake felt something twist in his chest when he heard that scream, even though he had only known the dragon for less than a day. And he triggered his first trap, which was a series of tripwires connected to containers filled with gasoline and fertilizer that made a crude but very effective explosive. The blast caught the second enforcer and threw him backward through the air and gave Jake the precious seconds he needed to grab Lyrian and yell at her to move. They burst out through the back door of the cabin just as more plasma fire turned the front section into a burning inferno, and Jake led them toward the tree line where he had prepared a fallback position during the night, while Lyrian was sleeping. Behind them, Ember fought the remaining enforcers with savage determination, and her injured wing did not stop her from using her claws and teeth and tail as weapons, and she breathed fire that melted snow and scorched the ground. Black Vex cursed in his native language as he watched his carefully planned mission fall apart because the human was more skilled than intelligence. Reports suggested, and the alien female was still combat ready, despite her injuries, and the dragon was proving nearly impossible to kill quickly. He made a tactical decision and ordered Kresh to keep the dragon busy while he pursued the 2 fleeing targets to retrieve the data crystal. The enforcer leader chased Jake and Lyrian through the forest, and his armor sensors tracked their heat signatures easily, even as they tried to hide and he found them in a small clearing where the human stood. Protectively in front of the alien female Vex spoke through his translator and told them they were fools to resist because they would die for nothing, and humanity would serve the council whether Jake lived or died. And it made no difference in the long run. Jake aimed his rifle steady and said, "Maybe that was true, but today Vex was not getting what he came for." Vex laughed and said the human could not stop him. Jake said he knew that, but Lyran could. The Enforcer sensors screamed a warning, but it came too late because Lyran had been gathering her strength, and she lunged forward with her energy blade moving in a blur of trained precision, and her blade found the weak points in the armor with surgical accuracy that came from 300 years of Alir fighting council soldiers. Vex roared in pain and swung his plasma rifle like a club, and caught Lyran across the chest, and the impact threw her backward into a tree, and she hit hard and gasped in pain and slid down to the ground. The Enforcer raised his weapon for a killing shot aimed at Lyran helpless form. Jake fired his rifle 3 times in rapid succession, and each shot was aimed at the damaged sections of armor that Lyran had created with her blade, and the first 2 shots sparked and ricocheted. But the third shot found something vital inside the armor, maybe a power cell or maybe a cybernetic component, and Vex armor sparked and died, and all his technological advantages disappeared in an instant. Without his armor enhancements, the Enforcer was just flesh and scale and bone. And Jake rushed forward using his rifle as a club, and fought with desperate ferocity because he was protecting something important and something worth dying for. When it was over, Jake stood above the fallen Enforcer breathing hard and his hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. In the distance, Ember roar of triumph echoed through the forest announcing that she had defeated the last attacker. Lyran pulled herself up slowly and pain was written across every line of her face, but she was alive. And she looked at Jake with respect and said, "He fought well for a human who wanted to live in solitude away from conflict." Jake helped her stand and said, "Sometimes the fight came looking for you whether you wanted it or not." They limped back toward what remained of the cabin, and Ember joined them along the way, and her wing was torn and burned but still functional, and the dragon lowered her massive head, and Jake, acting on pure instinct, placed his hand on her scaled snout and felt the heat radiating from her. He whispered, "Thank you." Ember eyes, which were ancient and knowing, looked at him for a long moment, and then she made a sound that was almost like a purr. Lyran said quietly that Ember accepted Jake, and that was rare because the dragon saw something worthy in him. Jake looked at the data crystal still clutched safely in Lyran's hand, and said they needed to get that information to people who could use it, and he asked about the resistance cell she mentioned. Lyran said if the cell still existed because the council was very good at finding and eliminating opposition groups. Jake made a decision and said then they would find the resistance together. And he surprised himself with those words, but he meant them because something had changed during the battle, and he had found a purpose again. Lyran smiled, and it was genuine and warm despite her alien features, and she said together, and they would need allies because this fight was much bigger than just 2 people. And a dragon. Jake looked up at the sky where distant stars waited in the darkness, carrying both threats and possibilities, and he said then they would find allies, and it was time for humanity to learn the real truth about their new neighbors in the galaxy. 3 weeks had passed since the battle at the cabin, and Jake Morrison now stood in an abandoned mining facility, deep in the Arizona desert, where the air was hot and dry and completely different from the frozen mountains of Montana, and around him gathered 24 people who had come in secret to hear what he and Lyran had to say. These people were soldiers and scientists and intelligence operatives, and even 2 politicians who had somehow kept their integrity despite the council attempts to corrupt Earth governments, and they all looked at the holographic display showing the data from Lyran Crystal. With expressions of shock and growing anger, Colonel Amy Price, who had served with Jake years ago in the military, shook her head and said this was insane. And if the information got out, there would be chaos. Jake corrected her and said when the information got out because they were not going to hide the truth, and the only question was how they would survive the fallout. When the council realized their deception had been exposed, Lyran stepped forward, and her injuries had mostly healed thanks to her species' remarkable ability to regenerate, and she explained that the council would move against Earth the moment they knew their lies were revealed, and humanity needed to be ready for that response. A scientist named Dr. Helen Brooks laughed bitterly and asked how exactly they were supposed to fight against technology that was centuries beyond anything humans had created. Jake replied that they would use what humanity always used, which was ingenuity and courage, and the refusal to accept defeat no matter how bad the odds looked. And he gestured to the display and said, Lyrian people had been fighting the council for 300 years and survived and even prospered in some ways, and they had learned how to counter council technology and exploit weaknesses. And Lyrian was willing to share all that knowledge. A former intelligence operative named Marcus Webb asked about the dragon because Jake had brought an actual living dragon to this secret meeting, and everyone was supposed to just accept that as normal. Outside the facility, Ember waited, and her massive form was hidden under camouflage netting that barely contained her size, and through the growing connection Jake shared with Lyrian, he could feel the dragon impatience and her desire to spread her wings. And Lyrian explained that Ember was not just a weapon but a symbol, because, in Alir legends, dragons represented freedom and the wild spirit that refused to be tamed or controlled, and the council had tried to exterminate all dragons when the Alir rebelled, but her people saved the last breeding pairs and hid them on sanctuary worlds, and Ember was proof that some things could never be conquered, no matter how powerful the enemy. Colonel Price studied the data carefully, and her expression grew harder, and she said they would need more than symbols, and they would need ships and weapons and training if they wanted to fight. Lyrian said the Alir resistance could provide those things, but they needed staging grounds and hidden bases, and Earth had thousands of remote locations like deserts and mountains and deep ocean trenches where they could build facilities without council satellites detecting them. One of the politicians, who was Senator Kate Miller, said they were talking about preparing for war and asked if everyone understood what that meant, in terms of casualties and destruction and suffering. Lyrian replied quietly that she understood perfectly because she had seen what slavery looked like, and she had visited worlds where populations forgot they were ever free, and where children were bred for specific tasks like animals, and where art and music and independent thought were luxuries denied to everyone, except the ruling elite. And her violet eyes blazed as she asked if that was the future Senator Miller wanted for Earth. Silence fell over the group like a heavy blanket, and then Colonel Price spoke and asked what they needed. Jake felt something shift in the room as scattered individuals became a unified force, and he said first they needed to verify the data independently by sending scouts to the locations Lyrian mentioned, where the council was conducting unauthorized operations, and they needed to get proof that could not be denied or explained away. Lyrian continued and said second, they needed to quietly contact other resistant species because the Alir were not alone in fighting the council, and the galaxy was full of races that hated being under council control, and if they could build a coalition of different species working together, then they could turn this from a simple rebellion into a full revolution. Marcus finished her thought and said they would transform it from Earth problem into a galaxy-wide problem, and he said he liked the idea even though it was dangerous and probably suicidal, but it had potential. Over the following weeks, the resistance took shape and grew stronger, and small teams were sent out to investigate council facilities on Earth, and they found exactly what Lyrian had promised, which was genetic research laboratories and mining operations using enslaved aliens, and weapons testing conducted on areas the council claimed were uninhabited. The evidence they gathered was damning and undeniable and terrifying because it showed the council true nature behind their mask of friendship. But gathering evidence was only the first step because they needed allies both on Earth and across the stars. Jake found himself traveling across the planet and visiting people he had served with in the military and talking to trusted friends who shared his concerns about the council, and each conversation was dangerous because council agents were everywhere watching and listening. But slowly and carefully, the network of resistance fighters grew larger. Lyrian worked parallel to Jake and used covert quantum communication channels to contact other Alir cells scattered across the galaxy and representatives from other species that wanted to break free from council control, and through encrypted messages that traveled faster than light. They began building bridges across the vast distances between stars. Ember became the resistance guardian and protector because the dragon could travel vast distances quickly and carry messages that were too sensitive to risk sending electronically, and she could defend hidden bases from council scouts who came too close. And most importantly, her presence inspired hope in everyone who saw her. Because if a creature from myths and legends could exist, then perhaps the impossible could be achieved. 6 months after that frozen night in Montana, when Jake first found Lyran dying in the snow, the Resistance was ready to strike their first major blow against the Council. They chose their target very carefully and selected a Council trade center in Geneva that was actually a control hub for all their Earth operations, and the plan was surgical in nature, which meant infiltrate quietly and download complete records and broadcast them globally before the Council could suppress the information. Jake led the ground team because he had the most combat experience, and Lorraine provided intelligence and tactical support from a remote location, and Ember waited on the outskirts of the city ready to evacuate them if things went wrong. Things went wrong immediately and badly. When Jake's team breached the building, they found not scattered administrators and office workers, but a full squad of Council enforcers waiting for them. Like the Council knew they were coming, Jake hissed into his communication device that it was a trap, and they needed to fall back right now. Lyrian voice came through, urgent and frightened, telling them to retreat because they had been betrayed. The firefight was brutal and violent, and Jake's team fought with desperate courage, but they were badly outgunned and outmatched, and 2 team members fell before they could retreat, and Jake carried a wounded soldier named Claire Davis, while firing his weapon with his other hand, and his old infantry training kept him alive by inches and seconds. They burst onto the roof with plasma fire scorching the air around them and burning holes in the concrete, and the extraction point was 100 yards away, which might as well have been 100 miles. Then the sky split open with a thunderous roar that shook the entire building. Ember descended like an avenging angel, and her scales gleamed in the moonlight, and her eyes burned with fury, because she had sensed Lyran distress through their psychic bond and came despite the risk to herself. The dragon arrival scattered the enforcers, and she breathed fire that was superheated to temperatures that melted their advanced armor like butter, and created a barrier between Jake's team and their pursuers. Lyran's voice screamed through the communication device, telling them to go and that Ember would cover their escape. They ran while behind them. Ember fought with primal fury, and her tail smashed through walls like they were made of paper, and her claws tore through the Council elite troops, and she was wounded and bleeding from a dozen plasma burns, but she did not stop or falter. When they reached the extraction point, Jake looked back and saw Ember standing on the ruined building silhouetted against the burning structure, and she was a living symbol of defiance. Jake whispered for her to come home. The dragon spread her wings and launched herself into the sky, leaving chaos and confusion in her wake. The raid had failed to secure the data they wanted, but it accomplished something else that was perhaps more important, because the Council control hub was destroyed, and their operations in Europe were crippled, and most importantly, the world had seen something impossible, which was a dragon fighting alongside humans against alien oppressors. The truth could no longer be hidden or contained. The world changed overnight after the Geneva incident because video footage of Ember attacking the Council facility went viral and was viewed by billions of people before the Council could suppress it, and questions erupted everywhere, and governments demanded answers, and the Council carefully constructed narrative began to crumble like a house built on sand. Then Jake and the Resistance released the full data cache to every news organization and government and social media platform simultaneously, and the revelations shocked humanity to its core because the evidence of manipulation and exploitation and plans for eventual subjugation spread across every network like wildfire. The Council tried to deny everything and called it propaganda and lies, but the proof was overwhelming and undeniable, and came from their own systems and communications. Within 1 week, Earth major governments had withdrawn from all Council agreements, and within 1 month, massive protests erupted across the globe, with millions of people demanding the expulsion of all Council personnel from the planet. And within 3 months, humanity stood on the brink of open war with an alien empire. The Council responded exactly as Lyrian predicted they would, because a fleet of warships entered Earth orbit and their weapons were trained on major cities, and the message was clear, which was submit or be destroyed. Humanity's answer came from an unexpected source, and it was broadcast across all frequencies from a ship hidden behind the moon. Jake's voice rang out clear and strong as he identified himself as Captain Jake Morrison of the Alien Human Alliance, and he said the Council was listening, and he knew they thought humans were primitives who could not possibly resist their might. But they had forgotten something very important. On the view screen, Lyraean appeared beside Jake, and behind them, through the ship windows, a fleet of vessels was visible, which included Alir warships that had secretly arrived over the past months, along with ships from other resistant species, and there, towering above them all, was Ember, with her scales reflecting the light of distant stars like a living banner of defiance. Lyraean continued, Jake thought, and said that freedom was not given but taken, and once a species tasted true freedom, they would die before giving it up. The Council Fleet commander, who was Admiral Therix, responded with contempt in his voice and said the Resistance had 20 ships, while the Council had 200, and their resistance was futile, and the dragon changed nothing. Jake smiled, but it was not a friendly or kind smile, and he said Therix was right that they could not beat the Council in straight combat, so they would not fight that way, and then he called out to Ember. The dragon moved with devastating speed and streaked through space using propulsion pods that Alir engineers had attached to her limbs, which allowed her to fly among the stars, and she targeted not the warships, but the command vessel where Admiral Therix sat secure in his belief of superiority. Ember crashed into the ship bridge like a living missile, and her claws tore through armor that was designed to withstand plasma cannons but not 1,000-pound dragon moving at incredible velocity, and the flagship spun out of control as its command structure was destroyed in seconds. At the same time, the Alir human fleet launched precision strikes on the Council fleet support ships, and they used tactics that Lyraean had taught them over months of training, which meant hit and fade and target weak points, and never fight fair when survival was at stake on Earth. Resistance cells that had been waiting for this moment struck at every Council facility. Simultaneously, and within hours, the Council's entire presence on the planet was dismantled and destroyed. But Jake knew this was just the beginning of a long war, because the Council would not accept defeat easily, and more fleets would come, and more weapons would be deployed, and more threats would be made. Yet something fundamental had changed, because other species across the galaxy saw what happened, and they watched humans and Alir stand together, and watched a dragon fly among stars, and watched the impossible become possible. Within weeks, 3 other species declared independence from the Council, and within months, 20 more joined the growing alliance, and the rebellion that Jake and Lyraean sparked began to spread like wildfire across the galaxy. The war lasted 3 brutal years, and it was costly and destructive, and nearly broke both sides because worlds burned and ships were lost, and countless lives ended too soon. But Jake fought in battles he never imagined alongside allies from dozens of species, and Ember was always at their side as a constant reminder of why they fought. Lyraean became the Alliance strategic mastermind because her knowledge of Council tactics was invaluable, but more than that, she became a symbol of unity and proof that different species could work together and trust each other and build something better than what came before. The turning point came at the Battle of Proxima, where the Alliance fleet, which now included human vessels, built with Alir technology, faced the Council Grand Armada in a confrontation that would decide the war outcome. Jake commanded the human contingent, and his ship flew alongside Ember, who had grown stronger over the years, and her bond with both. Jake and Lyraean had deepened into something unprecedented, and she was no longer just Lyraean's companion, but had become the symbol for the entire Alliance. The battle was pure chaos, with ships exploding and plasma fire lighting the void, and for hours, the outcome hung in perfect balance between victory and defeat. Then Jake saw their chance because the Council command matrix was coordinating the entire fleet from a central dreadnought, and if they could destroy it, the whole enemy fleet would lose coordination. He called Lyraean over the communication system and said he needed Ember for one last charge. He felt Lyraean hesitation through the bond they all shared, and she said the defenses around that dreadnought would kill. Ember Jake replied that not if the dragon had cover, and he asked Lyraean to trust him. There was a long pause, and then Lyraean said that Ember trusted Jake too, and told him to do what he must. The human fleet formed into a spear formation with Ember at its tip, and they charged the dreadnought while drawing fire and sacrificing ships to create a corridor through the defensive lines, and Ember flew through hell itself with her scales scorched and her body battered. But she did not stop or slow down when she reached the dreadnought. She did not try to tear it apart with claws and teeth, but instead did something remarkable, because she emitted a pulse which was a psychic scream that Lyraean had taught her to project, and it was amplified by technology that Jake engineers had developed. The pulse overloaded the dreadnought control systems and cascaded through the entire Council network. And for 30 crucial seconds, the Grand Armada was blind and deaf and unable to coordinate. The Alliance struck with everything they had in those precious seconds. When the battle ended, the Council fleet was broken and scattered, and more importantly, the Council will to continue the war was shattered, because they had believed themselves invincible and had built their entire empire on that belief, and the Alliance had proven them wrong. The Treaty of New Earth was signed 6 months later, and the Council still existed, but as a shadow of its former self, and it was stripped of its conquered territories and forced to acknowledge the sovereignty of hundreds of worlds it once controlled. Jake Morrison stood at the signing ceremony, wearing a diplomatic uniform that felt more uncomfortable than any combat gear he ever wore, and beside him Lyran represented the Elir people. With her silver-white hair gleaming in the light and outside through massive windows, Ember soared through Earth-sky, finally free to explore the world she helped save. Lyran said quietly that it had been quite the journey from a stranger freezing in the snow to this moment. Jake smiled and remembered that night 3 years ago, and said he thought he was just helping someone in need, and did not realize he was starting a revolution. Lyran said they started it together, which included Jake and herself and Ember and everyone who believed freedom was worth fighting for. Jake asked what came next. Now that they won the war, Lyran's eyes sparkled with violet light, and she said, now came the harder part, which was building a peace worth keeping, and making sure this never happened again, and teaching the galaxy that cooperation was stronger than conquest. Jake said that sounded like a lot of work. Lyran replied it would be hard, but she thought they were up for the challenge, and she asked if a certain stubborn human was willing to stay involved rather than running back to his isolated cabin. Jake laughed and said that cabin burned down, and besides, he found something better than isolation. Lyran asked what that was. Jake said he found purpose and family and hope, and he looked up as Ember circled overhead with her roar echoing across the city. And he said he found friends who would literally fly through hell for you. Lyran took his hand in a gesture that had become natural over their years together and said they would face the future the same way they faced the war, which was together. Outside Ember danced in the sky, free and wild and magnificent, and she was no longer just a dragon or a weapon or a symbol, but proof that legends could come alive and courage could triumph over tyranny. And sometimes the most important battles started with a simple act of kindness on a frozen night.